So, the next session is entitled Moving Storage Forward Globally. And this panel will showcase a range of successful CO2 storage projects worldwide, and we'll explore how the learnings from those projects can further fuel developments, improvements, and advanced technology. So we have on the panel Kyle Worth, Senior Project Manager at the PTRC, Peter Cook, Principal Advisor to the CO2 CRC, and Svein Eggen, Senior Geologist with Gas Nova. So I'm going to ask Peter, we're on the presentation track now, so I'll ask Peter if you could come forward and begin your presentation. And then after Peter, we'll go with Svein and then Kyle.
Well, thank you very much to SaskPower for providing me with the opportunity to talk very briefly, and thank you in particular for providing such a great project. This photograph here is of the Boundary Dam site, approximately 100 million years ago, when you did have a bit of ocean in this area. I'd like to briefly talk about global drivers, communication, again, how will the experience from existing storage projects move CCS forward, and also I decided to have a stab at what projects might look like in 10 years' time. This actually is from the Global Carbon Project, which is a great project that annually pulls together all the most recent information on emissions, sources, and sinks, and I do commend that program to you. Basically, as you can see, we're still on track here for a very high CO2 level, and it's just an inexorable rise since 1990, as you can see here. But the interesting thing here are the cumulative contributions they've looked at here. And again, you won't be able to read the numbers, but let me just talk you through it. On the left-hand side, on the bottom there, atmosphere at 1870, that's 288 ppm. And then it goes through and gets us up to the 395 that we're now at. And you'll see that's made up of a number of contributions. 87 parts per million coal, 65 parts per million oil, which comes as a surprise to many people, 27 parts per million gas, and 5 parts per million of cement. Now, obviously, there's some other contributions there in terms of some of the industrial contributions, but those are the ones that really matter. And the message really you can take from that is if we're going to continue with business as usual in terms of use of fossil fuels, then we really have no alternative other than CCS and storage of the CO2. The interesting one there, of course, is oil. And how do we move from liquid hydrocarbons to something else, whether that something else is electric cars, hydrogen cars, whatever it is. But other than actually going the biofuels route, and even there CCS of course counts, it's very hard to avoid CCS. And these numbers sort of add to the ammunition there. Just a couple of others that I'll just show you. And one is this just shows you the top 4 emitters for 2013. And that covers 58% of global emissions, with China now providing 28% of global emissions, which is an enormous number. You can see the growth rate there that's happened in the last few years. And United States 14%, EU 10%, India 7%. So that's the 58% that makes up global emissions. And the other interesting one that's come out of this program is this one, which now shows that in terms of carbon intensity, China has now overtaken the European Union. And so this really is a global issue. So there's no point in talking about, well, what share are you doing, what share are you doing? We've all got to be in there together. And CCS really is the only contribution we can make. We can make the contribution through CCS. So let me just briefly touch now on the issue of winning hearts and minds. And I'll read you this because you probably can't read it. The broader CCS story is one of various PR disasters across Europe in recent years and has resulted in an untrusting public and caution from investors. Certainly, the CCS industry's failure to educate the public, potential stakeholders, and win friends across the energy industry has created a hostile environment for future investment. Targeting potential investors, businesses, and the general public with campaigns that promote its benefits and allay fears about risk would go a long way to liberating CCS from the current commercial hiatus. And that's actually from a renewables site. So this is not somebody who you'd necessarily see as somebody who's going to support CCS, but you can see that the need is being recognized out there. I think part of the problem that we have is that we're just not talking to people enough. We're actually talking to ourselves a lot more than we're talking to other people, and that's part of the difficulty that we have. So it's very important that we don't lose the communications battle. And we need to be more effective in reminding people that there's no way to fully address greenhouse concerns without CCS. There's no compelling evidence that international agreements or a price on carbon will drive CCS. In fact, you could argue the other way. We need our own narrative. I was at a meeting a couple of weeks ago where there was a panel discussion about, well, why aren't things happening and so on. And quite honestly, it was a very interesting discussion, except for the fact most people ended up by saying, well, it's not our fault. It's somebody else's fault. It's because of policy. It's because of this, because of that. And I think we've actually got to start taking charge of our own destiny a little bit more and being a little more out there, as demonstrated by Boundary Dam, for example. So what have we learned from projects, and where are those projects? Well, these are the small-scale projects, and you won't be able to see the detail there, but you just have to take it from me that most of those dots there, which are the smaller-scale projects, the demonstration projects, are in North America. I mean, that's where the action is, and elsewhere in the world, not a lot of action by comparison. Obviously, there's some going on, and there's one or two dots that are missing there in China, I'm sure, because this was put together a year or so ago. And if we look then at the total amount of CO2 that's been injected, and again, you won't be able to see the detail here, but these are all the projects, and that line, that black line there, which you probably can see, is actually 1 million tons of CO2. And the main message there is there's not many projects that actually get over that 1 million tons CO2, and that's total amount of CO2 injected. So this is excluding EOR, where you don't have monitoring and so on. Okay, this is storage projects. If it's an EOR project that actually includes monitoring, such as Weyburn, then that would be included in there. But most projects, of course, most EOR projects don't fall into that category. So overall, we don't have a lot of CO2 being stored by the existing projects, particularly in terms of the amount of effort that's really needed. So what have we learned from the storage projects to date, recognizing we haven't stored very much CO2? We've got a knowledge of real cost now. We've got a recognition that everything takes longer than we anticipated. As a result of the projects, regulations have been clarified and improved. I say improved in most cases, not in all cases. And I do have a concern about some of the regulations relating to injection in the United States, for example, which I think are quite unduly onerous in the circumstances when you're dealing with CO2. I think it's quite ridiculous, some of the rules that are proposed for the US there for deep injection. But overall, the regulators now have a better understanding of the issues through the fact that we've been doing projects. We certainly have confidence we can monitor effectively, and we have a better understanding of storage risk and how to manage that risk. The other thing is we're really building up a body of expertise and know-how, which I think is going to be very important for the future. We've certainly got a better understanding of key subsurface issues, such as residual trapping and things of that sort, and we've got real insights into dealing with communities, dealing effectively with communities. Obviously, there are some stories out there that are not as effective, that are stories in terms of the outcome not as being as we wish, but even there we learn from things. And we've certainly understood the value now of providing the tires to kick and something to see through these projects, and we can't, in any way, we shouldn't devalue that. It's incredibly important. I mean, the Otway project We've literally had thousands of people visit that site now from around the world, right the way through the US administration, members of cabinet and so on from a number of governments. This sort of thing is incredibly important, as I'm sure it will be even more so here in Saskatchewan. So finally, what do I think a storage project in 2024 might look like? Well, overall, based on what we see at the present time, I'm not sure that we'll see much more than, say, an additional 50 million tons of CO2 stored at this stage, based on what's in train and so on. I hope that that's a pessimistic view. I certainly think that we would have concluded by that stage that storage capacities are more than adequate. I think the pessimistic view in terms of trapping and so on, there's no real basis for it. Yes, there was a basis earlier on, but I think the evidence that's coming out of it now suggests that we do have a large storage capacity. I think that's going to be largely used in oil and gas basins because that's where the best reservoirs and seals are, the costs are the lowest, the risks are best known, and also the oil companies are the most comfortable there. So I think EOR-related projects will continue, related storage will be very important, including outside of the United States, or North America perhaps. There may be increasing attention to enhanced gas recovery in the future, and I think that would make a lot of sense. And I think mainly it'll be storage related to gas processing, but increasing substitution of geological CO2 for EOR by power and industrial sources will become important in the next decade or so. And I think it's important to re-emphasize that it's not just about getting the $20 or $30 a ton for the CO2 that you're selling into EOR projects. It's also the know-how that goes to that. It's almost an end-of-pipe solution that you're able to hand it over to an oil company that has the regulations in place, that knows how to manage the risk. It's got all the approvals it needs, and it's not got onerous conditions attached to those approvals. So all of these things together are the thing that's driving us in the direction of EOR, not just the $20 or $30 a ton. I think there's no signs of a lot of projects being related to coal in the future, unless there's new incentives or coercion. And by coercion, I really mean regulation. And I personally think there's a role for regulation there. I think we'll see things move much faster with regulatory standards on emissions. And lots of people are very much opposed to that. They're quite often the same people who are quite happy to put on their seat belt, which is regulated to say that you will drive a car only when you're wearing a seat belt. That may be trivializing it, but I don't have any problems philosophically with regulations if they're the right regulations, personally. I think the position of storage with respect to unconventional hydrocarbons, in other words, shale gas, and that's particularly shale gas perhaps, is an interesting one. And we may start to see an interesting interface developing with those sorts of shale gas and things of that sort. I think we'll see storage more regulated by the community on the basis of demonstrable low risk, direct financial benefit to the community, which is something people tend to steer clear of, but that's the way it's things such as unconventional gas have been driven in the United States and driven very effectively. And there'll also, by that stage, by 2024, be greater public concern regarding emissions. I think obviously the focus will have to be on large-scale storage projects, but I still think there's a continuing need for targeted small-scale storage projects as well. So that's a view of 2024. Thank you.
Thank you. Svein Eggen?
Ja, Svein Eggen.
Svein, sorry.
Never mind. The title, Moving Storage Forward Globally. I think the simple answer to this is really that we need more projects, more projects like the one we are here to celebrate today. I will, of course, elaborate a little bit more on this, but this is basically the main message. I will concentrate a little bit on the experience that we have in Europe and also Norway. And But I will start with paying a little tribute to the project that we are here to celebrate. And I will say that there is some similarities between ski jumping and a successful CCS project, in the sense that the result that the audience see is when you are in the air. Prior to that, there is a lot of preparations and things that are unseen by the people around them. And also there was some speaking about the mad scientist this morning. And certainly, when you are on the top of a ski jump, you could say that, or people would say that you are mad to go off and start descending and make this jump. The fact is that you're not mad, you're just well prepared. And so that we have a lot of time to prepare and evaluate and do all kinds of choices on the way up to the ski jump. You can even write your will if you want. When you start executing your project or when you start running, the only thing you can do is to concentrate and make the most out of it. Your bosses will sleep bad at night, but if you're well prepared, you can manage. And then you are in the air. And this is where you are today. This is where the ski jump starts. We are down in the audience cheering for you and hoping that this is going to be a success. If you take the same analogy over to Europe and see at the same ski jump, it seems like the ski jump has changed a little bit. It's become much harder to reach the top and much harder to reach an investment decision. And as you know, there are currently only 3 projects that seem to have a fair chance of becoming reality. Our friends from UK can maybe comment on this, but anyway, that's what in the databases. And thank you, John, for reminding us about the Mongstad, which is not on the list. Anyway, looking at the challenge in the EU area, it's been expressed like this, that CCS is caught in a vicious circle. Firms will not invest in CCS because it's financially risky. It's financially risky because the public acceptance is low and there are big hurdles to large-scale deployment. And the public acceptance is low because there is so little experience with CCS. So we're in a way biting ourselves in the tail. And the EU Commission has themselves realized approximately the same things. Out of 6 necessary conditions for successful CCS, 1 is red and 2 are yellow, and the rest are probably green. And the red one is the financial, the business case. There's no business case for CCS in Europe. The price of emitting CO2 is down to €5 per ton. And there is a lack of successful demonstration, and public acceptance for storage is low. So to sum up, there's no business case. Some people say that there is no policy, and there is a distrust among the public regarding storage. So, a business case. One positive thing happened in Norway when they introduced a CO2 tax for the offshore in 1991. This was really the trigger that made it interesting for Statoil and partners to develop both the Sleipner and the Snøhvit cases, which otherwise had to pay a CO2 tax. I mean, these projects are very important in order to demonstrate that CO2 injection and storage is viable, also offshore. They even have an offshore CO2 pipeline on the Snøhvit field. And so these have been very important. But there was a business case behind them. It didn't happen by itself. The other part of a business case in Europe could be CO2 EOR. This has been very successful in North America. It's not so easy to implement in the offshore region. It's been discussed several times, and there have been a lot of calculations back and forth. Basically, it's stopping because there's a lack of CO2. So anyway, if you wanted it, it would be very hard to do it. And there is a challenging economics and timing. As a geologist, I have to say that, well, basic things about CCS is it's not going to happen if there is not a storage solution. That has been said earlier today. And as a geologist, I have to say that storage is not something we have invented, CO2 storage. Nature has done that itself for millions of years, and there are large numbers of huge CO2 accumulations underground, which nature has set up itself. So basically, storing CO2 underground has already been demonstrated. We can do it ourselves. We have shown that in many cases. So what is the problem? This has been done. What is the problem? If you look at EU, One of the things that has gone wrong in EU, and there are several things, but this is one thing. We can say that there's been a lot of effort on R&D around CO2 storage in Europe. There's been very little efforts gone into piloting and demonstration of CO2 storage on land. If you look at comparing it to the graph that was shown from the North America, which has a large number of small-scale injection projects, they are important in two respects. Both, of course, that you show people in the region that this is something we can handle. This is something that is not very mysterious. It's a standard operation that the oil industry can handle. The other thing is that it is important for maturing the storage potential in an area. So the fact that CO2 storage is something abstract, which is very remotely from most people, there's a lot of skepticism and distrust. And of course, this has also been fueled by lack of knowledge and also misinformation about CO2 storage. We also say that there's a lacking a positive narrative about the climate mitigation, energy security, and value creation around CCS and fossil fuels in general. The lacking of bankable storage potential has already been mentioned by previous speakers. When you want to make an investment decision, you need to know what you're investing in. I mean, you people are investing in storage, in capture plants and power plants, then you have a very strict procedures of how you qualify the technologies. The similar thing you have to do with the storage potential or its storage location. When you make the pipeline and you drill the well, you need to know quite for sure how much CO2 you can pump into this reservoir for 25 years. In Europe, there's been several works aimed at getting an overview of the storage potential, but these are very regional type of studies, very general, and in terms of classifying them, they are something like a hypothetical resource. And you need at least 5 years to mature these resources into something you can invest money into. And this maturing of storage resources is lagging behind in Europe. Offshore, there are some work that has been progressing. It's establishing storage location, both on UK side, the Norwegian sector, and also in Dutch sector. So the work is progressing, but there's still too little to be to make confidence. Storage is also about communicating risk. There's been several speakers about that earlier, so I'm not going very deep into it. And this is the conflict between the technical definition of risk and how people recognize it. I know people we can do this very beautifully technically. This is a nice equation, probability of an event multiplied by the consequence. Very easy. And why can't everybody understand that? The public has a much broader definition and less stringent. We know that people are willing to take risk if it's voluntary and if there is something in it for them. It also information battle. I mean, there's a lot of information going around. Some of this is misinformation, the whole discussion around both energy, climate, and also for that makes CO2 storage is complicated with strong and resourceful stakeholders which are telling very opposing stories. And there's a lot of deliberate misinformation, and all this adds up to something which is very difficult for the public to understand. On top of that, geology is something very mysterious and difficult for people to understand. Okay, I have to say a few words also about technology development. This is not what is stopping CO2 storage. It can be improved, but it is not what is stopping the development of CO2 storage. In Norway, we have two efforts. We have a research program called CLIMIT, which has been operative since 2005, where we have developed world-class research institutes and also technology suppliers along the whole value chain of CCS. And we have this technology center at Mongstad, which will be talked about tomorrow. Also, we are also supporting several small-scale injection projects, which are, as I have already mentioned earlier, vital for the development of both tools and understanding. It is so that Norway is blessed with a lot of sedimentary rocks on the continental shelf, but we do not have any sedimentary rocks onshore in Norway. We have something on Spitsbergen in Svalbard Islands. So we have tried to establish a CO2 storage laboratory up there. And we're also looking at doing experiments in glacial moraines on land in Norway. Apart from that, we are trying to cooperate with other countries that have successful CO2 injection pilots, like the KETSIM project, and also trying with US. Coming up is the Horizon 2020 program in EU, and hopefully there will be more focus on small-scale injection projects. Okay, main learnings: no business case, no CCS, no storage, no CCS, and communication, very difficult and very critical for moving forward within the CCS. So I will not repeat all the statements here. Stopping only by stating the fact that especially in CO2 storage is important with learning by doing, because geology is very different from one site to another, and you always get surprises. So this statement from the country south of us: good judgment comes from experience, and a lot of that comes from bad judgment. This is something we need to bear with us, and so learning by doing. Okay, thank you.
Great. So I thank you very much for your presentation. And now I'd like to ask Kyle Worth to come up to do his chat.
Good afternoon. Basically, my presentation is going to focus on the projects that we've worked on for the past 15 years at PTRC. And to begin with, I need to give props and thanks to Mike and John Gale for giving us some nice comments for mentioning the Weyburn project in PTRC. But the Weyburn project finished in 2012, and we spent 12 years looking at research associated with site characterization and MMV, but it concluded, and we developed a best practices manual for CO2 storage for an EOR project. So on the heels of that project, we started two new projects, which I call kind of our next generation projects, and that's Aquastore and SAS CO2 User. So Aquastore is obviously associated with Boundary Dam, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because you're going to hear from Ken from tomorrow afternoon on the full details of Aquastore. But on the heels of Weyburn, we're advancing what we've learned in Weyburn. We identified gaps and challenges, and so SAS CO2 User was developed, and not many of you probably have even heard about it because it just started this past year in April. So it's funded by the province of Saskatchewan and United States Department of Energy, and it's focusing on applied research for commercial EOR and storage. So very specific areas of research that have been provided to us or guided to us by the operator. And these areas are looking at CO2 conformance, well integrity, so casing integrity and corrosion, and MMV programs. So they kind of tie in nicely, a combination of EOR aspects and storage aspects between the two projects. So in Saskatchewan, you've heard a little bit, but we had many advantages for advancing our CO2 storage projects. A few of those things are, first of all, we have a very supportive regulator in Saskatchewan, which allowed us to proceed with the Weyburn project as well as drilling the wells for Aquastore. So that's one huge benefit. The second being is that the geology allows us to do this in Saskatchewan. And as a part of this, we have access to a very extensive core laboratory here in Saskatchewan, which is somewhat unique to Canada. But there is a local subsurface laboratory here in Regina that stores over 350,000 core boxes and over 2 million vials of core drillings. And this is from wells all across the province of Saskatchewan. So we had a very, very good starting point for site characterization to ensure the integrity of our reservoirs. And thirdly, which should not be taken granted for, is the areas of our CO2 storage projects. Generally, the public is used to oil and gas activity, and they have a good understanding and are accepting of CO2 storage. So how have we been successful in our storage projects? And there's lots of logos on here. But it wouldn't be without international and national support, whether it be sponsors, regulators, or researchers, our projects wouldn't have happened. And just to list the organizations that have been involved in our projects to date, we've had companies from Asia, Middle East, UK, Europe, Africa, Australia, and North America. So most major parts of the world have been involved in some way in sharing knowledge and building capacity from some perspective. So one of the challenges that we've noticed going forward, and I'll clarify one of the comments from previous, but you'll see on the left-hand side here, the Weyburn project, it is the largest CO2 monitoring project in the world. And what this chart is showing is the tons of CO2 injected on a daily basis. So lots of times you don't see this because it's not taking into account the recycled CO2 that's putting back into the field. So this gives you the true volume of CO2 being injected into a field at any one point in time. The IEA Energy Roadmap in 2030, for 2030, said they were proposing a 2,000 megaton reduction in GHGs. And that equates to about 413,000 tons a day projects in order for that to happen. So I'd like to stress here that, a few of the comments made previously is that the importance of more demonstration projects and that those demonstration projects can be scaled up in order to meet the needs of these new projects that are going to have to come online. So we see those two things. There's not a lot of projects at the appropriate scale to ensure that we're going to start meeting those demands. What we've been working on ourselves, currently the two projects, Aquastore and SaskCO2 User, both of those projects obviously have research organizations and sponsors internationally and nationally. One thing I haven't heard mentioned here today is the volumes of data that we're starting to record and keep track of in the MMV. They're enormous data sets that are sometimes, unbelievable. A month's worth of seismic data from our passive seismic arrays, 20 terabytes of data. That's a month. That's not in addition to all of the other monitoring data that we have. So there's challenges associated with that, not only sharing that data within our own internal group, but also with other projects that we want to contribute and help knowledge sharing with. Public outreach, again, obviously, this is a key critical component to most CCS projects. We have a very comprehensive communications plan before we started Aquastore. I think it's gone very successfully from the table discussions with the farmers and the leasees and the cattle owners near the project to the general outreach that we've undertaken. It's been very successful from a project perspective. And whether it's a blessing or a curse, Weyburn had the opportunity to have an enormous amount of data available to it to begin with. And while we're able to build very competent models in order to make predictions, it's also a bit of a curse because there's not too many areas in the world that will probably have the same level of detail that we had. So we are undertaking evaluations on minimizing that data set to understand, well, how much data do you really need to still have an adequate prediction and make your assumptions? Additionally to that, Aquastore has some unique and prototype tools that we're using, and I think we'll see how this is going to help move storage forward. We have a permanent seismic array, which is one of the first times it's ever being used for a CO2 storage project, as well as we have are utilizing casing conveyed fiber optic lines for seismic purposes. And so with a few technologies like this, we're still seeing the technology progress forward. I'm going to finish with the challenges, and many of these are repeated from today already, but obviously a business case and economics must be improved to ensure the success of CCS or CCUS. For areas that don't have EOR, I think it's mentioned here that we need more demonstration projects and see through those pure storage, CO2 storage projects. Public engagement and outreach, while we're pretty fortunate in Saskatchewan, many jurisdictions are going to have a lot tougher job than we've had. And as Peter mentioned, realistic regulations. We can't have regulations that are preventing these projects moving forward. And PTRC is committed to CO2 storage. And we'd like to see and educate policymakers and regulators on what MMV programs look like, some of the public outreach, and we're hoping to contribute to moving CO2 globally forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Kyle, for that presentation. So, as I mentioned, if anyone has any comments or questions for any of the panelists, just go up to the microphone. My first question is going to be for Peter. Peter, what would you say are the biggest obstacles to storage? Is it technology, cost, public acceptance? What would you say?
I don't think technology is a major holdup at the present time. A holdup for individual projects is not having the storage capacity in the right place, and there's not much you can do about that other than to put a longer pipeline in, and that certainly is an inhibition with some potential projects. I don't see regulation as being an inhibition other than the new regulations in the United States, which I think are a significant inhibition. In fact, if you wanted to dream up regulations to stop CCS going ahead, I can't think of better ones than they presently seem to be working on. So that's a local inhibition, maybe the wrong regulations. Other than that, it really is a matter of the business case, as was emphasized by the second speaker. Why would you do it at the present time? And the only reason you do it is because you're compelled to do it, or because you can make money doing it, and you can't at the moment, unless you've got EOR, or because you see a long-term strategic benefit in doing it. And maybe that's something that we hopefully will see industry recognizing a little bit more in the future and getting involved in it. So no one inhibition, a number of ones that sometimes act locally, and then you've got some more general ones, particularly the issue of why would you do it is probably the biggest single issue at the present time.
Okay, thank you. Kyle, did you want to add anything? Or? Sorry, it's fine. Are there differences to consider when looking at offshore versus onshore storage options?
Yeah, the costs of establishing an offshore storage is bigger than doing it onshore, and that means that you have to elaborate more on to reach a higher level of knowledge about your storage reservoir before you do an investment. And that means that also the timing of making decisions when you have a full CCS project with a capture plant and a storage plants is difficult to fit on the same timeline, because a storage project need a lot of work upfront in terms of seismic, maybe drilling a well, and this kind of work. So to make an investment decision on the same timeline can be challenging. But of course, basic is that the costs of establishing a pipeline or the storage location is much larger offshore. When you roll out your pipeline, you need to be quite sure that the storage location is going to work for 25 years.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from the floor.
Okay, Kelly Tambimoto from the IEA Greenhouse Program. It strikes me that the cheapest part of the CCS chain is probably currently one of the Achilles heels in the overall process. The thing that really concerns me most is that nothing is being done to characterize the storage resource, and in developing those bankable storage credits. I mean, if you look at parallels in the 60s and the 70s, most self-respecting countries and governments had big geological surveys that characterized mineral resources, petroleum resources, and so on. And that basic knowledge, was something that contributed to the explosion of the minerals industry and the petrochemical industry in terms of extracting those resources. Now, in terms of public policy, we need to drive the development of that storage capacity knowledge base. Nothing anywhere out there seems to be pushing it. I mean, I was quite happy to see the Norwegian program working on an atlas and other things. But I think we need more of this in order to get further ahead. So I'd be interested to hear what the panelists think.
Well, for 8 years I was director of the British Geological Survey, so I'm certainly a supporter of being of geological surveys having a major role to play in this. You're right, Kelly. It's patchy. Some countries have started on this, and in Australia it's not too bad, actually. A number of studies have been done that are sort of pre-competitive. And certainly the work in the United States and parts of Canada has been similarly pretty good. But many parts of the world, you're absolutely right. And this is where it's a matter of how far pre-competitive work goes. Is it okay to define these things on the basis of the theoretical or technical capacity of a basin? Or do you actually need to go down to the specific area where you want to put CO2? And maybe that's a step too far for geological surveys to get down to the detail. That really becomes part of what a company should do. The problem you then have is that for the most part, the companies that can do that are actually the oil companies. And they very often have all the information they need. It's not the coal companies. They don't have that information available to them. So at the moment, we've got a bit of a mismatch. And we need to bring together the industries a little bit more to do exactly the sort of thing that you're talking about. So I agree with you, Kelly. There's no simple answer.
Svein?
Yeah, I'll comment a little bit on your reflections on storage, because I think that this is also a little bit about the industry, the type of industry that are approaching CCS. I mean, the power industry and the utility industry, they have a very good knowledge on how to qualify their technology. They don't know anything about geology. The oil industry, on the other hand, know exactly how to handle the uncertainties that you have in the underground, and they know how to make decisions. And they know what kind of work that is needed to do this. So we see that storage is happening very easily when the oil companies do it for themselves. They know exactly how to do it. But when you're approaching it from a more industry or utility side, this becomes very difficult. And of course, there's a lack. Currently, there's a lack of business case for those who are going to do storage. We see that CCS is happening when there is CO2 EOR, which is making the business case. But pure storage, there's no business case, and therefore there's also no industry that are approaching this. If there was a business, somebody would start maturing the storage resources because it would be an asset.
Great, thank you. And if I could just add as an anecdote, just 2 weeks ago I was at a conference, an energy conference, the Atlantic Brook, which included about 60 Canadian and German kind of business people, including the vice president of the Bundesstaat, and there were presentations made, and the talk of carbon capture came up, and even the Boundary Dam project was mentioned. And for I'll call them one of the naysayers that was a presenter, didn't talk about the technology. They just talked about storage. And that was what they focused on in terms of questioning the whole process, from a political point of view. And that person, I corrected that person, but it was kind of interesting when they kind of say, you know what, carbon capture is not the solution because there's not enough storage to solve the problem. And I know that had a powerful impact, at least on the Germans there, because of a lot of the issues that they're dealing with. Oops, sorry, I just cut myself off. Maybe I can throw another question to the panel in terms of this project, Boundary Dam 3. Do you see it mitigating any of the current obstacles with storage, like public perceptions? Do you think it can have an impact or not have an impact? Peter?
It'll have, I think, quite a profound impact. It's a pity it's not just outside Washington or somewhere like that, but it is where it is. And it's going to help the tourist industry in Saskatchewan as well. They have a lot more people flying in. But yeah, I think it's an incredibly important project globally because, as has been said, it's actually proving that it is happening. It's not just unproven, which is so often thrown at CCS. It is proven. So very important.
Yes. Do you want to also answer that? We have a question on the floor.
Yes, my name is Curtis Sharp. I'm with American Electric Power. Much of the discussion here has been on EOR and opportunities to put the CO2 in the ground and use it for enhanced oil recovery, but that's not going to be available everywhere. My question to the panel is, who should maintain the ownership and the legal liability for that CO2 into the future, and how would that best be handled?
It's fine. Since you laughed, you can go first.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that are very heavily debated in Europe. In the regulations, the EU Storage Directive said that the operator of a storage location are supposed to be responsible for the location 25 years after it has been shut down, and you should also bear financial responsibility for whatever can happen there afterwards. And well, the industry has said very clearly that this is, under these kind of regulations, this is not going to happen. Nobody can take upon themselves such a responsibility, which are open-ended and without any limitations. So how that is going to be handled, I think that also the challenges that you're up against is a little bit about what kind of experience you gain on the way. I mean, you need to learn a little bit how these storage sites develop and what kind of challenges that you will have after it is closed down. Most likely, the highest risk is at the moment when you are closing it, because then the pressures are highest, the CO2 is still mobile, and then the pressures will gradually decline and the CO2 will go more and more into dissolution in water, etc., etc. So the risk is reducing very, very rapidly. So I think that maybe this calls also a little bit for learning a little bit by doing to see how this can be handled in a proper manner. I mean, this is regulations in other areas also developed a little bit in interaction with the industry and operators to see how things can develop. So I don't have a firm answer to that, but I only see that nobody is willing to take upon themselves the responsibility that the EU Storage Directive has put on an operator. So this is obviously not the way to go forward if we want CCS to happen.
Okay, Peter?
Yeah, there's a public good involved in mitigating CO2. And yes, you could argue there's a risk associated with putting it in the ground. It's very low risk, and you compare that to the risk of doing nothing about CO2 and putting it into the atmosphere. And there's no question in my mind that that ultimately government should take on responsibility for these things after an appropriate length of time. A number of governments have already implemented things of that sort, including the Australian federal government offshore, where it has agreed to take on liability. I think it's after 40 years, but there's a clause in there that allows you to do it after a shorter time. It's the only way to do it in the long term, to provide the certainty to the community that it's going to be looked after. Should there be bonds and all that sort of thing attached to it? Well, I think yeah, that's okay for the initial period. I'm not sure there's any justification for perpetual bonds in there, but you may want to establish a fund out of those things. Not unlike the sort of orphan well funds that you have in Canada. That sort of thing you could do, but ultimately, government is the only body that can really take over that long-term liability.
Okay, good. So that will wrap up this panel. So I'd like to, on behalf of everyone, thank the panelists for the chat today on storage.